So now to introduce Neil Dalal. Neil is Associate Professor of South Asian Philosophy and Religious Thought at the University of Alberta, and he works between the Philosophy Department and the Religious Studies program, which he directs. He received his PhD in Asian Cultures and Languages from the University of Texas, specializing in Indian philosophy and Sanskrit textual studies, but also has spent some years in India studying and practicing with sannyasins and pandits there. His primary research is on Advaita Vedanta and the tradition of non-duality, specifically contemplative practices, exploring the kind of praxis and phenomenology of meditation, oral listening, and contemplative self-inquiry. And he has a film, Gurukulam, which explores a kind of living lineage through sensory ethnography, which is, you might want to check out. But he's currently also researching the politics of mantra transmission in modern yoga, and working both within academia and with yoga practitioners to think about contemplative pedagogies and the decolonization of yoga more broadly. And these questions around the politics of cultural appropriation, the mindfulness industry, and the kind of neo-Vedanta movements is what he's mostly going to be speaking to us today. And we're really glad to have him to help us untangle what is often a very emotive topic within contemporary yoga discourse that we'll be looking at today. So now over to Neil.
Thank you, Theo, for that introduction. And also thank you to Theo and Jim Mallinson for this really generous invitation. It's an honor to be here. I have to admit I'm a little trepidatious as well. I originally suggested some other topics I could talk about because two reasons. One, as Theo mentioned, I'm not really a cultural theorist or a political scientist. I'm someone who works in classical yoga, pre-modern yoga mostly. But I have been thinking about this for quite some time, about the appropriation debates. And also just because it's such a contentious issue, right? There's some deep sensitivities around the topic. And whenever we talk about appropriation, someone's self-identity or cherished practices are going to be challenged in some way. So it's a tough topic. But I'm offering this really to help us parse out some of the complexities of the issue as I've tried to work through it myself. So what is this complex landscape? What are some of the issues and contentions? And I should say at the outset, though, some of the things I'm going to say will challenge the possibility of appropriation. And I'm going to point out some rebuttals to those challenges or possible ways out. And I do think there are genuine ethical issues going on, but not necessarily in the ways that the public discourse frames appropriation. So along these lines, maybe I think maybe it's responsible to state my own positionality here. Obviously I'm a scholar, but I'm also a second generation Indian American. I was born in Boston and raised in the Boston area in a Hindu family and tied to a broader network of a broader Hindu community. I've also, through my whole adult life, I've been kind of closely tied to various people in spiritual communities and modern yoga practices. And also as an adult, I've spent extended time studying in traditional contexts, specifically in Advaita Vedanta communities. So I can put on these different hats. And so even though I have deep criticisms of what's going on in terms of appropriation, I also have a deep appreciation for what is happening in modern yoga as well, and the really positive impacts and the ways, different ways, different systems that are being created in these evolutions of, in terms of various things, not just health and wellness, but social justice or dealing with trauma and so forth and so on. But what's fascinating to me is when I put on these different hats of positionality and I take a kind of insider perspective to the different premises and worldviews and sort of guiding frameworks, when I follow that to its conclusion, I find myself in a very different, radically different positions on where I fall on these debates. And I think it's pretty vital that we do think in a sort of different kind of insider ways, at least as thought experiments, to have empathy and generosity and a charitable kind of conversation through this process. So I guess one thing, I'll just share a quick anecdote because, how did I get into this topic from my normal areas of research. Many years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, a local yoga teacher invited me to give a workshop on Sanskrit to her 200-hour teacher training. I didn't know this community. I didn't know this teacher. I knew that she was much more spiritually inclined than maybe a lot of secular kind of modern yoga practitioners, and also had interest in esoteric types of practices, but that's about it. Long story short, I went in, talked about pronunciation, a bit of history of Sanskrit, workshop different key yogic terms and different asana posture names, etc. And at the end of this workshop in our Q&A, the students requested that I teach them the Gayatri Mantra. And I politely declined in that moment. And they were really surprised. And I could see that surprise on their face and sort of taken aback that they weren't being freely given a spiritual tool. And so I explained to them, first off, I don't consider myself a ritual authority, right? I'm not a priest, I'm not a guru, I'm not their father. And I'm not going to go into the details of the Gayatri Mantra, but many of you know that traditionally it was only given in like private initiation. And so I also I explained to them, I felt uncomfortable knowing that from an Orthodox or Orthoprax perspective, chanting Gayatri out loud is often frowned upon. Right? So it's usually chanted inaudibly or silent, or just muttered under your breath or silently. And lastly, I just wondered out loud, I wonder what the traditionalist or Orthodox Hindu, in this case Hindus, would think about the ways that this mantra is now embodied, like in tattoos, or how it's consumed as music or on CDs or now MP3s, or the ways it's performed and sung rather than chanted, and whether they would think of this as harmful appropriation. So I just left it at that. I thought the workshop went fine, all was good. I went back home. 3 weeks later, the yoga teacher emailed me. It turned out, this is completely unbeknownst to me, that chanting Gayatri was a central spiritual practice of this teacher training. I had no idea. And she was also incorporating the mantra she was constructing rituals with the mantra. So it turns out that she wasn't at the workshop when I was teaching. It turns out the next day when they met up with her, she started off the class with group chanting of the mantra, and half the class refused to chant. And they cited me in the concern over cultural appropriation. So she reported that after several days, she was able to get them back on board, like get through all the disturbance that had been caused, and get them all back chanting Gayatri. And she also requested that the next time I come in, that I help her with her intention, which was first to honor and appreciate the tradition and the language, and also to empower the students to be able to chant. And this made me step back and think about a lot of things. So first off, just in terms of my authority and or my agency, and how it could be construed in ways that was unintentional on my part. So to what degree in that case were they, because I was coming in thinking I'm coming in as a scholar. So to what degree did they look at me, my background, or did they orientalize me in ways that construed me as having that authority to empower them for mantra, like as transmitting mantra? It also made me wonder to what degree, as I think more about it, to what degree Savarna power moves through in that context too, so through a ritual artifact like this mantra, in ways that I might not intend it. And then more broadly speaking, I started to think about the complexities of cultural appropriation. We had it's a longer story, we had a bit of a dialogue, and she gave several reasons why. Because I just to backtrack, I responded apologetically. I didn't mean to just make a disturbance. But at the same time, I said, this is an interesting teaching moment to consider these concerns. Given that no one was presenting as South Asian, they all presented as white in that community. And so what does it mean to be stepping into a different cultural tradition? especially with a very specific ritual artifact such as this mantra. So that brought up a few things for me. One was, as I started to look into appropriation, I started to see a more and more complicated landscape. And it was became a bigger and bigger puzzle without any satisfying answer, which is a frustration I still kind of hold. But that's also why it's so intellectually interesting to me. Also, I realized that I think it's really important to, when we think about appropriation, to start grounding it more into specific artifacts, specific traditions, specific histories, rather than just speaking globally about yoga, which is, we all know, is so diverse and variable and changing across cultures, and even in South Asia versus now what we have as a more globalized yoga. So that's really what brought me to this. And one of the things I'll just, as a side note here, I think is important to think about is expanding the domains of what we think are the aspects of yoga that are subject to appropriation. So at least in public discourse, I find there's a lot of critique of what I think of as gross appropriation, like coarse appropriation. Things like depicting Ganesha on underwear, or like a bath mat by a toilet, or very Orientalist forms, like someone dressing up as the goddess Kali on Halloween, or these other sort of very, I don't want to say it's trivial, but maybe empty performatives, like whether or not you say namaste at the end, or namaste improperly at the end of a class. So there's all these. I think that that's all important, but and of course, the bulk of what modern yoga practitioners are doing is posture practice. And so when we look at posture practice, which is often the emphasis of, is this appropriative or not? We come into a very particular discussion because of all the, this wonderful recent research on the modern histories of posture practice, being a transnational, hybrid, multiple origins kind of cultural product. And so that complicates, asana very much so. But when I look at authoritative spaces like teacher trainings or big media outlets like Yoga Journal, I find a lot of broader things beyond asana or these coarse kinds of appropriative issues. So texts, sacred narratives, ritual artifacts, philosophical worldviews, there's so much more, right? That are being disseminated, in authoritative ways by those who control, the power of modern yoga. So let me share a slide here. So because the question is, what is appropriation? Just to start with. Oh, Theo, I think I'm not I think I'm, oh, I got it, sorry. So what is harmful appropriation? Well, I think first of all, what we find is discourses of ownership and theft. And I'm thinking particularly in the public discourses I come across. So in popular discourse, it primarily denotes issues of ownership and property rights. Refers to practices, symbols, rituals, texts, knowledge systems, and other such cultural artifacts that are taken from a root culture by members of another culture without permission. Then we come into issues of exploitation, tied to theft, extraction, or notions of cultural imperialism, particularly when such artifacts are sold for profit. And third, we have damage. Damage, distortion, desacralization, disrespect towards or misrepresentation of cultural forms, so forth and so on. I think this is really constitutes the bulk of, or variations of these issues constitutes the bulk of what we find in the public discourse. One thing I want to add, and one thing I want to argue in this talk, is that in terms of widening, we have to think about other issues around disassociation. So decontextualization, disassociation, and disembodiment of cultural forms from religious, ritual, and cultural contexts of those religions or cultures. All right, so I only have a handful of slides here. For those of you who love PowerPoint, I'm sorry I don't, but just a few slides here and there. So when one little side note here I think is important to understand is that we have to make a distinction with appropriation of tangible artifacts and intangible artifacts. So tangible artifacts, for example, the material like skeletal remains of an indigenous person held in a museum. There's a, legally at least, there's a very different set of legality around that and repatriating such tangible artifacts to their root communities. When we're thinking of intangible artifacts, like sacred narratives or texts or ritual practices or like mantras, for example, at least in North America, there is no legal precedent for that kind of ownership. Right? So things like patents and copyright are really for individuals or individual corporations. So it doesn't extend, just because this is an argument that will come up here and there, I find that I have no legal requirement to let go of ownership, for example, of a spiritual form. But I'll put that aside now because I'm more interested in a broader ethical set of issues. Now, when we're looking at public discourse, underlying the issue are almost always assumptions of purity and impurity, or authenticity and inauthenticity of the cultural artifact or the practice. And I think part of the problem in terms of communication breakdowns and the messiness of this dialogue, especially outside of scholarly communities, is that there's radically different framings of how people understand what cultural products are. So let's share this again. So why is this, what are these worldviews? What is causing this confusion and messiness? Just broadly speaking, I think, and this is a bit reductive, but just for the sake of discussion, broadly speaking, we have the cultural essentialist. So in the case of the Gayatri Mantra, for example, this is going to, somewhat through my talk, I'm going to be focusing more on the Hindu communities, even though I think we all know yoga is far broader than just Hinduism across pre-modern South Asia. But the cultural essentialist is looking at yoga broadly, or specific artifacts or traditions or lineages as having essence, right? So there's essentialism or essence, but that essence is embedded in culture, whether Hindu, Buddhist, or indigenous for that matter, given the great degree of indigenous-based practices that also flow through modern spiritual worlds and yogic spiritual worlds. Then we have the universalist essentialist, which I find more often in spiritual communities or modern yoga communities, that yes, artifacts have essences as well, but those essences are spiritual essences and are unbound by culture. And then third, we have the non-essentialist, who argues there are no essences to cultural artifacts, or for that matter, cultural groups. So I'll discuss these each a bit in a bit more detail. So for the traditional essentialists, let's say the Orthodox Hindu, or even maybe the average Hindu in the diaspora, oftentimes make this argument, that holds a doctrine of continuous essence rooted in traditions. So they're essentialists, but culturally located. And this opens up the possibility that this framing premise looks at authenticity and inauthenticity, or corruption, or purity, impurity, as the degree to which the essence is continued to be held in its quote unquote proper cultural form. When we look at a more modern yoga or spiritual doctrine of continuity, or as our essences as universalist and not located, there's a different metaphysics of universalism involved here. And so generally speaking, the essentialism or the essence of the cultural artifact transcends culture, religion, and localized tradition. So to go back to this case study of mantra, for example, what I find quite pervasive is a metaphysical view of mantras as vibrations in these spiritual communities, which is really fascinating to me because on one hand, that's very, has a naturalistic kind of scientific angle. So thinking of the mantra as vibration or like a fingerprint of like frequencies or sound waves or some kind of energy potentially. And that also has esoteric angles, which allows one to, for example, intuit meaning of the mantra potentially, or embody it in some way and understand it without understanding the Sanskrit or its cultural location or cultural histories or cultural interpretations in, let's say, in this case, Hindu traditions. So this kind of universalism, in a sense, frees the cultural artifact, the essence, from lineages, from gurus, from texts, from any ethno-religious boundaries, or anything else deemed dogma, right, or religious, right? Especially if we're thinking about spiritual but not religious identity. So in that case, in this worldview, at least implicitly, cultural origins and roots are adventitious to the purity or impurity of the spiritual form, the spiritual essence, I should say. And in fact, now we find almost an inverted version of what constitutes purity and impurity. Because in this view, potentially, corruptions of essence are tied back to what's considered dogma, right? The rigid ways of maintaining a cultural form. So I think right off the bat, this profound difference in worldview underlies a lot of the discussions not in public discourse, people not seeing eye to eye, but not necessarily recognizing how different these underlying premises are. Now, if I move to this third category, well, let me just backtrack for 1 second. The universalism that we find in modern spiritualities is also interesting because it's framed as democratizing spiritual practice and as egalitarian. And there's really some interesting beneficial aspects. We can think of it that way. But whether it's actually neutral or benevolent is hard to say because it also potentially reflects positions of power. And so we start seeing these different perspectives that are being, that are in tension but are simultaneous in some way. Now, let me move to the non-essentialist. When I'm thinking of non-essentialism, I'm often thinking of scholars and historians who come to this kind of conclusion. And there's various arguments. So for example, what I'd call a non-essentialism argument by change regarding intangible cultural artifacts, which sees things just in constant change, right? So from a historical perspective, we're often deconstructing essentialist assumptions. There's no unchanging essence, right? Because we see historical change, we see reinterpretation, we see reinvention, syncretism, etc. So yoga as a whole certainly doesn't have an essence or some fundamental continuity because there's such a great diversity there, variability, but also that there's no essence to any particular cultural artifact, right? So whether in the spiritual, kind of modern spiritual but not religious view or in the traditionalist or Orthodox Hindu view. So this is an interesting position. I do think kind of as a side note here that it's easier from a historical standpoint to challenge the Hindu views because or the traditionalist view in general, because that's seeing essence as in cultural form. Whereas the spiritual universalist view is a theological view that, as a historian, we don't necessarily challenge theological views, even though we can situate it in historical genealogies. Another kind of non-essentialist argument is what I call the non-essentialist argument due to origins or hybridity or cultural exchange. So when we're looking at different cultural artifacts, in the case of yoga, certainly, we find multiple origins, transnational hybridizing processes, grafting, and cultural exchange. The case study of asana is the perfect example for this. And so when we reframe our view of a cultural product as a transnational hybrid or a global product, that undermines the very premise of ownership, of essence and of ownership. So what's interesting is this position sort of leads to also a kind of universalism in the sense that it places no boundaries on yoga or yoga's ownership. Now, I don't really identify as this historian, but I do dabble in historiography. As a historian, I would, and I think this extends broadly, that we don't think of ourselves as prescriptive or engaging in advocacy or certainly activism for the most part, usually. But what I think is interesting is when there's this inherent value to doing history just to understand what has happened. But there are some potential issues of the way our historiography might challenge discourses of damage, distortion, or misrepresentation. So the basic idea is that origins, essences, cultural forms cannot ground a logic of purity or impurity or authenticity or inauthenticity. Right? So that whole binary gets challenged. And this supports universalism and pluralism and non-ownership. But then I always run into this question that I think is interesting for a discussion, that to what degree do we extend non-essentialist arguments or positions? Because on the one hand, there's something really healthy about it in terms of deconstructing naive essentialisms or potentially harmful essentialisms. And then on the other hand, I wonder though, is there an uncharitable slippery slope that might take place, right? To what degree does it eliminate the possibility of harmful appropriation, at least in terms of the public discourse we have? Right, so where to draw these lines remains an open question. And it also raises the question of how do we think about the moral impacts of our own research, right? Because yogic, especially yoga, within South Asian religious scholarship, I think yoga scholarship, especially modern and pre-modern yoga scholarship, is maybe some of the most public-facing scholarship we have now. I mean, in North America, we have roughly, 40 million yoga practitioners, right? So there's this, it was just wonderful, right? That someone cares about our scholarship beyond the 20 people in the world who will read a publication that we publish. But how do we think about these impacts? And I don't mean just in terms of, in this case, maybe defending against critiques of appropriation, but other ways or other agendas. Let's say perhaps a right-wing Hindu nationalist agenda might instrumentalize our research. So we don't have control of that, but it's something we have to think about. All right, so those are one group of non-essentialist arguments, but we can also talk about non-essentialisms regarding cultural groups, right? So here's a really interesting issue, is that appropriation, any critique of harmful appropriation, is almost always premised on an in-group and an out-group. But there's no clear lines demarcating either group that at least that I can find. Right? So group identity is also fluid, full of differences, and lacking any kind of homogeneous essentialism. So so one problem that comes up immediately is, how would we even delineate a group and who would speak for a cultural artifact or a tradition or an identity, right? To do that, to make that line is going to cause several problems, because we might end up stereotyping a particular group and falling into harmful essentialisms. We may inadvertently exclude certain people from that group. which is actually then reproducing similar problems that we might be concerned about in appropriation. Because once we start excluding or including, we might fall into different hierarchies. Right? But here's the dilemma. So on one horn, we have that, but on the other horn of the dilemma, we have, if we don't draw any line, do we a priori erase the possibility of appropriation? So this is another struggle to, how do we parse this out and think through that? But these trajectories of non-essentialisms, just to come back to summarize it, they come back to forms of universalism and non-ownership. So to what degree that's a slippery slope to causing some kind of harm in the ways that it's difficult to account for the harms that a community or their communal identity might be facing. And to what degree this moves to, absolutely to individual relativism. So these kind of non-essential, it's not about just cultural groups. We could also deconstruct notions of tradition or lineage or other such things that are often held in essentialist ways. So one thing I think is to look for is, how do we find or construct responsible use of group terms, like Hindu, for example? How do we do that while recognizing historical change and non-essentialism and these various other political issues, but also holding the potential harms of these kind of in-groups or the ways they might view themselves as being victimized in some way? So these non-essentialist views, they often bring me, so as an Indian philosopher looking at classical Indian philosophy, I'm always reminded of a parallel issue in early Indian Buddhism. So many of you are well aware that in early Indian Buddhism, that the basic metaphysics is that any individual's mind, body, sense, organ complex is undergoing constant change, in constant dependent origination. And from moment to moment, you're not the same person. At least there's no substantial essential self moving through time without change. And you'll never find that essence. Now, this raises some really interesting issues around ethics and well-being in this metaphysical worldview. Because this mind-body complex is just a conceptual fiction. Right? In absolute reality, then, it's a punctualist view that I'm changing moment to moment. So why should I care? If that's the absolute position, why would I care about my future self? Why not eat as much candy as I want and smoke cigarettes and do whatever else that gives me the most hedonistic pleasure in the present moment for this self, rather than care about its future well-being? So there's interesting arguments around this beyond the scope of this talk, but just to note that there's many different positions here, but I think the presiding Buddhist position, early Buddhist position, would be that, yes, this mind-body complex is a conceptual fiction and it's only provisionally real, but it's still necessary and it retains value for my future personal welfare. And of course, there's great need to cultivate, in this case, wholesome mental states and mental factors and virtues. So one thought is to look to that kind of view and bring in that kind of a more complex metaphysical and ethical view as a balanced view that can extend to cultural identities or cultural products, and then hold their vital meaning or how vital they are to the well-being of a community, while still holding the possibilities of, or the realities of non-essentialism. So perhaps it's wiser to look at particular texts or specific ritual artifacts or applications, not as essences, but as family resemblances or convenient designators. that can be culturally located, that can still hold value, that can still be vulnerable to appropriation, despite change and lack of essences. Right? So I think it's important that we find ways of attributing meaningful value to these cultural forms and these community identities. And to some degree, I think this is maybe more debatable, but to some degree that might open up a bigger door for some level of intellectual property rights, not in a legal way, but maybe at least in a way to resist facile ownership in modern spiritual communities when that's problematic or harmful appropriation. Okay, so I have a few other issues I'll just briefly run over because I know there's not, our time's limited, but maybe the biggest issue that comes up explicitly in terms of a critique of the possibility of harmful appropriation is arguments around indigenous agency and indigenous permission. So like in my own anecdote, or from a historical standpoint, many of us are well aware of the ways that South Asian agents shared and exported yoga. And in many cases, in the process, they were universalizing in yoga and stripping it of, culturally specific practices or forms, like in the case of Hinduism, or in the case of someone like Krishnamacharya, who does a lot of great research on how he did this, to make yoga more palatable and to spread it. So one of the fascinating things, by the way, with this too, is that now we have these authoritative figures, like these big players like Krishnamacharya or Iyengar, Pattabhi Jois, or whoever, right? But or Kuvalayananda and the science side of it and the medicalization of yoga. We have all these different angles we can think about. But in popular discourse, I find this idea of permission being extended quite far, right? So I've seen people, or I've heard people tell me personally that, I don't think there's appropriation because my Indian colleague or my Indian neighbor said it's fine. Right? So the way this can be instrumentalized and employed is, I think, becomes, when it's extended that far, it becomes problematic, at least. So the issue with indigenous agency and permission is that it offsets questions of theft and ownership, right? Because it's being given, it's being shared, it's being gifted. And it's oftentimes gifted, we might be critical and say, well, this is being shared in order to, become a global guru or to gain a following or something like that. Or we can be more charitable and say it's a utilitarian process of, trying to promote the most good through yogic practices, which can offer, health and healing and spiritual maturity, whatever. The problem, though, is looking at the ways this might legitimate spiritual practices or deny accusations of appropriation wholly. And when we extend it a bit, it starts to become a way to provide authority to disseminate cultural products in a spiritual marketplace. And so I think implicitly indigenous permission is an agency is becoming transitive to justify ownership and commodification. So that there, I think we're getting to some deeper problems. And just to come back a little bit into this indigenous agency idea, there's a really interesting debates that have gone on for quite some time in the scholarly community about how we view these indigenous agents. So first of all, I would raise the question, to what degree is indigenous permission transitive to the communities that they seem to represent? Right, so just because, some, like in that case, the yoga teacher actually told my anecdote, she told me that one of the reasons it wasn't appropriation is that she had been to an ashram in Rishikesh where the teacher had told her it's fine to chant Gayatri. So to what degree is that permission transitive to a broader Hindu community is the question. But also, when does it constitute reasonable consent or not? Another question that come up is, what kind of power is is implicated in the yogic consumer, that they have to purchase these cultural artifacts, to go to India and take a training there, or et cetera, so forth and so on. And then lastly, to what degree are these processes of exchange embedded in colonialist extraction and Orientalist assumptions, or even Orientalist essentializations? So in these academic debates, it's tricky of how do we parse indigenous agency? Because some people want to look at this as equal partners, right? Engaging in fair collaborative exchange. Others want to look at this as the indigenous agents as actually passive agents who are caught in tacit coercion, who lack social capital and power within the asymmetrical power hierarchies of colonialism. And that, I think, extends as a sort of the remnants of coloniality post independence of India. So regardless, how we answer those questions, where we fall on those kinds of questions, are going to radically change how we fall on the question of appropriation, especially when we're thinking of hybrid or global exchanged artifacts. Okay, just a few more things I'll bring up. So other potential arguments that I've seen coming up around undermining the possibility of harmful appropriation is, one, there's a great degree of concern, I think justified concern, about Brahmanical exceptionalism or Brahmanical supremacy or caste oppression, and how that runs through yoga. And here Gayatri is a really interesting example, because it is a ritual artifact that's a gatekeeper for who has access to Vedic learning and Vedic ritual classically, at least in pre-modern times, and wielded in different ways into the modern period as well. So that's, excuse me. So that's one issue, that's worth a deep degree of discussion and thinking through it. I also find questions around diaspora wealth, especially in the United States. So like model minority status, white adjacency, wealth, representation, political power, and whether that offsets the possibility of appropriation in a way that's harmful or makes them victims. I think there's a lot of interesting rebuttals to that. I don't think that's quite a fair issue, but there are also issues of the ways that of whether it's Brahmanical exceptionalism or Hindu nationalism might flow through diaspora ways of thinking about appropriation, perhaps unconsciously, intentionally or unconsciously. So another really interesting issue is that I've often found that Hindu nationalist agents co-opt the appropriation critique for a nationalist agenda. And so I don't think that offsets the harms of appropriation, but I think that's a really problematic conflation. I mean, even regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, of whether you're critical or supportive of that, of right-wing Hindu nationalism, it's still to me an epistemic error of conflating cultural preservation as preservation of the nation state. So to conclude here, I think one of the things I want to argue beyond all these complexities is that I think we need to move from a narrow conception of cultural appropriation to a broader one. And this starts bringing in deeper issues or issues that I think are not dependent on the essentialist worldview, that have to do with exclusion, dislocation, and representation. Right. So one issue, for example, is potential epistemic harm to cultural artifacts and erosion of root cultural products, artifacts. Similarly, dislocation of root communities from their ancestral traditions. Right? So this is tied to a dislocation of their epistemic authority in modern yoga. So to what degree then is modern spiritual agents and modern yoga practitioners imposing foreign epistemes onto neo-colonized Hindu subjects, where the Hindu subject becomes a consumer of a new episteme or product rather than the producer or a maintainer of their inherited tradition. Right? So I think to some degree there's a deeper issue of uncritical, in this case Hindus, it could be Buddhist or indigenous or whoever, whatever community in the discourse, but uncritical assimilation or acceptance of reimagined forms or different goals, different intentions, different values within asymmetrical power dynamics. So the degree to which that may be happening is also the degree of non-autonomous cultural adaptation as well. Right, so this raises other questions that come up here is to what degree, if this is the case, and the problem is coming back to these hybrid products, because there's this tension in these views. But to what degree would decolonizing yoga, if we subscribe to that as an ethical thing we should aspire to what degree would that include eliminating these forms, at least within root communities? And this all comes down back into maybe this is the bigger elephant in the room, which is deeper issues around Orientalism, white ownership, white normativity, in the ways that ties into deeper issues of white supremacy, and racialized capitalism, and other forms of oppression that may be taking place. Right? So this is all interconnected with the stereotypes of Orientalism and the ways products are capitalized and put into the spiritual marketplace, but potentially perpetuating really deep issues. So just to summarize a few things here, share the screen again. We have concerns about enacting a process of erasure, or these are my concerns at least, erosion of cultural diversity, lack of representation, which is also potentially a sign of silencing, a type of silencing, insufficient opportunities, potential marginalization of root cultural groups, and this all comes down to potential inequities and other such issues of justice. So where do I think we should move forward with this? I think moving forward, we should have a more robust ethic of stewardship, or maybe a kind of care ethic within both Hindu and spiritual, but not religious, or these modern yogic spiritual communities, for the cultural survival of intangible artifacts. I think this ethic could engage in engaged citizenship of cultural responsibility and preservation over a purely rights-based approach, which also comes back to legalities of ownership, or the freedom of speech and other things that may come up to challenge appropriation critiques. And I think we can discourage passive consumption of disposable artifacts, viewing artifacts as disposable, which also can be tied back to the universalism of spiritual essences. But I want to suggest this without an uncritical return of traditionalism, because I think that's also potentially deeply problematic, or to strong assumptions of essentialisms or purity discourses. And also kind of like a care ethic maybe, or stewardship, an ethic of friendship in terms of collaborating in this process rather than battling, these different groups battling each other. And then lastly, I think for everyone at the table, including scholars, we need to engage in more critical reflection. And to me, this is, I don't think there's clear essences to yoga, but I do think there's a pretty strong continuity that yogic, to me, a really deep part of yoga is reflection, right? Reflexivity and looking at identity and positionality and so many other things. We find that across so many traditions of yoga. But so in this context, looking at our positionalities and identities vis-a-vis this broader issue of appropriation. And last two things, I think we need to cultivate a third space, a safe liminal space to try and work through these issues with openness, trust, and clarity. Because I just think that the dialogue breaks down all the time. and it becomes angry and accusatory, and it doesn't know. Oh, it's not very constructive in that sense oftentimes. And then lastly, a much bigger topic is what would decolonizing yoga or specific cultural artifacts mean in this particular world and within the particular complexities of yoga, which I don't think are actually really totally unique. They're very different than what we find in, let's say, indigenous communities, given various issues around potential genocide or settler colonialism, or the maybe a lesser degree of cultural exchange and hybridity, but I see that more on a spectrum. So this is a much bigger discussion. So what would it mean, for example, to recenter epistemologies? All right, so I want to save time for more discussion, so I will stop here and thank you and namaste.
Thank you, Neil. That's thank you for what's a really thoughtful kind of exploration of the issues without and for suggesting kind of ways forwards and possibilities without kind of closing down possibilities of of there being ongoing questions, because it feels like this isn't something that should be solved quickly or easily. It feels like something that we want to be talking about more. I was really struck by the kind of clarity of the way that you kind of laid things out, particularly that idea of different kinds of essentialism and kind of the relativism that can creep in to kind of scholarly discourse. As somebody trained in as a religious studies scholar, we don't use the word syncretic anymore because everything is syncretic as far as we're concerned. So the idea of syncretism is our kind of that can, you're right, that can give us that can slide easily into a kind of relativism that doesn't allow for people's deep experiences of meaning and of belonging and of identity. I'm struck by this idea of stewardship, and I'm reminded of a kind of more traditionally kind of indigenous idea of the difference between the land belonging to you and you belonging to the land. And I think that there are similar things that we can say here with regards to culture. I wonder if you're kind of aware of that distinction, first of all.
So tell me the distinction again.
Is the difference between the land belonging to you, or in this case, the culture belonging to you, and you belonging to the land, that it's a responsibility rather than a right. It's something that you don't get to walk away from, and you don't get to kind of own in that sense. It owns you, kind of idea.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. I love that.
Yeah, it's not mine. It's an indigenous way of thinking about it, but I like it. I'm aware of the questions coming in. I'm going to come to in the second. But I did have one question which may be difficult to answer, which is around how we can, if it's possible, to separate these issues from those wider issues of not just decolonization, but actually kind of, as you say, white supremacy, capitalism. In the end, it becomes a problem that's almost too big to talk about or too big to solve. And I'm struck by, do you think it's possible to have conversations that are meaningful in the sense of change, given that a lot of the power isn't being held by the people having the conversation in many ways?
I don't know. I'm not necessarily optimistic about what's going to happen moving forward, but I think there's an ethical responsibility that we push forward and work on it and have the discussions. And at least from an individual level, it's so difficult to think about changing big systems, and especially with yoga, because it's so massive and so popular in practice. But I think from an individual level, we do have an ethical responsibility to really start thinking through this and an engaging discussion, particularly those people who are in authority positions. So whether it's scholars or yoga teachers or leaders of particular communities, traditional communities, I think we need to have a greater awareness and not just lock down on a position as well.
That's a good point, and it links us back to stewardship again, that if you become part of in any way an authority in a tradition, then you are duty bound to have that authority with it. Okay, I'm gonna start with a question from Vishal here, who is identifying as Hindu. I have noticed an increasing number of Indian origin teachers based in the West condemning Western yoga, yet seemingly represent and engage in the same form of yoga that they're denouncing. Can you elaborate on the term Western yoga and why the term is kind of propagated in these pejorative terms as if yoga in the West is a single monolith?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, I mean, first of all,
it's a good one.
First of all, we can be critical of the use of Western or Eastern, right? That's already putting us in this kind of Orientalist binary of essentialisms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because of this hybridizing going back for so long, kind of going back to what I'm talking about, this history of forgetting, right? So as a practice or cultural product goes into, if I can use the word Western now, it's going to be molded to different intentions and ideologies and interests and goals, et cetera, right? And then we have this, famous phrasing of the pizza effect of how these exchanges go back and forth and creating, a cyclical process. And it's gone on long enough that well, the other premise of this kind of discussion is going back to purity and impurity and pre-modern yoga as being the pure one. But then there's a forgetting of what that entails, right? So I think in the traditionalist or kind of Hindu worldview, there's an assumption, there's this sort of smoothing over change and not seeing it, becoming blind to cultural change with the assumption of a continuous essence. And so then many teachers of Indian origin coming to, let's say, North America, teaching yoga, they're reproducing those changes, right? They're already reproducing a hybridized artifact. I don't know, as Theo mentioned, this very idea of syncretism is so pervasive that, so we let go of the pure kind of idea, but if we do look back, we can find these distinct changes, right? So that's what a lot of historians are doing, is really brilliant work on what these changes are happening. So I think it's being propagated in pejorative terms because there is this feeling and this experience amongst Indian practitioners and Indian yoga teachers or in the diaspora that what they're seeing in popular spiritual modern yoga is foreign to them. And they don't have power to control that or change that. They may feel very alienated. It's like, an Indian Hindu diaspora person here, where I'm in Canada at least, going into a yoga studio, like average yoga studio class, may feel very much an outsider. Not simply because they don't have they don't align to the normative aspect of, you're supposed to be a thin, beautiful, middle upper class white woman as sort of the ideal yogi or yogini here. But it's more than that, because now it's looking at your own cultural tradition and it's becoming other to you even in that context. So I understand why that would become, people would be, Indian diaspora Hindus would become quite critical of that. Yet they might be engaging in problematic discourses because of these histories.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay, another a simple one. Nico Timmerman's asking, which type of appropriation do you think does the most harm? It's
an interesting question. I don't know how to quantify harm.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, is it the most people? Is it the deepest harm? Is it the most destructive? Yeah.
I put up that image of Apu from The Simpsons, because that's an interesting kind of the whole interesting issue itself. Like, how harmful was that in a satirical cartoon, voiced by a white actor? And if you things of that sort. But yeah, I don't know. I think people get upset about the gross, coarse stuff. which harms religious sentiment, like Ganesha on a toilet or something like that, which is just kind of crass and deep in a commodified. So it has no even spiritual kind of practice there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I tend to be more concerned about the deeper issue. Personally, I'm more concerned about the deeper issues around exclusion and extraction and silencing and marginalization. So to me, that's more my interest here.
Mm-hmm. Kind of wider patterns of things that may appear to be subtler, but are actually more profound in many ways. Yeah. Okay. So Claire is asking if it's wrong for Westerners to engage in any Sanskrit chanting. Where does appreciation become appropriation? I guess the difficulty here is that you're being asked to be the gatekeeper at that point, whether it's okay for you to even answer that question.
Right. So this is my own struggles with the ways my agency gets construed, because do I answer that as a scholar? Do I answer that as someone who's raised in the Hindu diaspora? Do I answer that as having some kind of authority from my traditional training? My first gut reaction was no, I don't think it's wrong. But because we can argue that all of yoga that's being practiced or consumed is appropriative, but it's not necessarily harmfully appropriated. And so now we have this bigger kind of question of where do we draw lines between harmful or non-harmful appropriation, or neutral or benevolent appropriation. Or for that matter, is there such thing as neutral or benevolent Orientalism, or is it inherently harmful all the time? So, yeah, I think one starting place is to start thinking about, like, the very act of thinking and inquiring and raising this question, and then looking into the histories. In this case, let's say of Sanskrit and mantra transmission would help answer that. But I think the struggle I have with this is these issues of authority, right? So who has the authority to give a mantra? Like, even in the case of a guru or a priest, and also it brings in issues of, who is a Hindu? It's like on all these levels, we come into these complexities, right? So is Hindu identity necessarily an ethnic one? What about white convert Hindus? Or what if someone is not identified as Hindu, but they're not of Indian, South Asian descent, but they've spent a lifetime in a very traditional lineage, and they're deep experts in that lineage, right? Like, does that justify in a way that? But I think the simple answer is that to think about more respectful ways of engagement, right? So if you're commodifying the chant and selling it, maybe that's something to step back from or question. Am I engaging by commodifying it? Am I putting it in a different level of exploitation versus, or the way one might be teaching it, right? So I'm less concerned about the person who's privately in their home, chanting a mantra, than the ways it might be commodified, for example.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, because it's about exploitation, right? I'm going to skip the question from Sally because I know the answer, and I'm going to type it in the chat. I'm going to attempt to ask Dominic Wischek to ask his question live. If that works, we'll try. Dominic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, Neil. Yeah, so I think you've said it really already, and so the idea is, I'd like to, you have spoken like a philosopher, you've spoken in a somewhat formal way, which is so great because it leaches out all of the passion, and I think that's very helpful for this particular topic. And I was just thinking about a formal philosophical way of introducing the idea of intentionality or motive into this discussion. I mean, in Canada, there's been this paroxysm surrounding Dr. Erica Lopez Prater, who's just recently lost her job. at Hamlin University because she displayed a manuscript, a medieval manuscript of one of Rashid ud-Din's works showing the Prophet Muhammad receiving Quranic revelations. And some of her students accused her of blasphemy, of showing an image of the Prophet, which is not allowed in some schools of Islam. So there's been this big debate about this, but in everything I've read about this, there's been no mention at all about her intention, about her motive. It's as if it's purely a matter of karma, it's purely a matter of action, of the deed, rather than, and people are not taking into account the moral or ethical dimension of motivation and intentionality. And if somebody has no intention to harm, then can they commit, can they commit cultural appropriation?
Yeah, interesting question. First of all, hi, Dominic. Dominic is down the street somewhere from me.
I was going to say he's not far, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Actually, that case, by the way, an instructor at the department is going to share images today, and I'm waiting to hear back what's going to happen if there's going to be a controversy. So I do think intention is important. And I don't think in that case of this Hamlin University situation that, I mean, she did state an intention, right? She's an art historian. From what I gather from reading some of this about this, that she's an art historian engaging in comparative art history and understanding the intention is to understand, in this case, to understand the diversity of the use of these images across different Islamic traditions, which is also not monolithic. So I think in that case, her intentionality does offset the issue and the context and the way she's framed it all, right? There's, I mean, for those of you who don't know, there's a lot of details in that case. So I think intentionality is quite important. But there's still this tension of to what degree does intention offset impact? Because I think the intention in spiritual communities is often different. I'm very charitable in that I take the average yoga spiritual practitioner as being very sincere, really engaging their practices for their own well-being or in authoritative spaces for the well-being of their students, right? There's an ethic of non-harm that's running through those communities rather explicitly. But I think it's the naivete or the ignorance of how of what the impact might be actually happening, because there's not an understanding, or it's been washed out or overcoded in some ways of the deeper issues going on, but when it's potentially harmful. So in that way, I don't take the individual to task. I think of this more as a systemic issue rather than the individual too.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Are you okay for maybe 2 more good questions, Neil?
Sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'd love to go to Valerie Vizina live as well, if you can. Does that work?
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. So I guess I just have to introduce myself here. I'm Valérie. I'm a Métis, which is, for those of you who don't know, Indigenous recognized group in Canada. And I actually was very curious about how you imagine this reconciliation in like the moving forward at the conclusion of your talk. About how to, do the cultural preservation and without essentialism or traditionalism. And this is an ongoing debate within Indigenous communities. And at least in my community, there's always like this struggle of like, we want to preserve the tradition, the culture, and so on, but also we don't want to fall into the eugenics and having to do, blood quantum and like, measure who can belong or who cannot. And so I'm very curious when it comes to yoga, how you see this happening, like more concretely, because I was like, practically, this is really nice, you know. Yes, I agree with you that we should do this, but how do we do it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, I don't have a good answer. And this brings up for me the idea of bigger collaborative discussions with communities that have dealt with this in particular ways. So it'd be really interesting for Hindu communities and yoga communities to be dialoguing with indigenous and Métis, like here, Métis communities about these different aspects. I think and I don't know enough about the specific to Métis issues, but blood quantum, this is going back to the cultural group essentialisms and where we draw the lines and how problematic that can be. I think broadly speaking, just on a very simplistic level, or at a beginning level, we need more rigorous understanding. We need, I think it's important for scholarship to be sharing the sort of rigors of scholarship. And then I also think there needs to be more representation of whichever community is at stake. But again, for me, in this talk, the tension for me in that is, what is preservationism or stewardship regarding an artifact that is arguably hybrid? Like, how do we get around that sort of issue without coming back to purity concerns, or just seeing it as a pre-modern, like, oh, the essence of the Gayatri Mantra is how it was in the first century BCE or something like that, as we find in Dharma texts, for example. So I'm not sure. I don't know. To be honest, I need to think through that more, because I haven't been approaching this as much in a prescriptive or activist kind of way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valerie. Yeah, and I wanted to include that slightly to put you on the spot, because you're right. Often we talk about this kind of thing as scholars, and to talk about it as a community member is a different question, right? So I hope you don't mind that one. It's difficult, right?
I wonder if we can, hold all these different cultural products without erasure, at least.
Yeah.
Because that's partly my concern is the ways that things get erased. I'll just give you a little anecdote. Talking about Gayatri, I was talking to an elderly Indian couple not long ago from India, born and raised in India, and immigrated to the US. And I said, hey, will you chant me Gayatri? Okay, I know I'm going against what I said about inaudible chanting. And they chanted it in the way that, the same tune as Deva Premal, this well-known New Age.
Yes.
And I was really surprised. I was like, where did you learn it that way? And they said, well, we heard a bunch of our friends chanting it that way. So again, now it comes in like communally, which I already critiqued. And they learned it in this new way. So there's these interesting issues, but my point is that they weren't clear about the Vedic style of chanting it. I mean, there's many Vedic styles, but in terms of having swaras and pitches and the Gayatri meter, actually. And so that brings me to this, like, that's partly coming back to my concern of when the traditionalist artifacts or other forms of artifacts are completely lost. So how do we also maintain? It's not to say to get rid of the modern ones in those communities necessarily, but how do we not lose? How do we have stewardship to the other forms?
I think you're right. That kind of erasure is really important. I'm struck by how widespread that can be. I think, for example, myself and other kind of researchers into yoga in Britain, for example, we've been saying for a while that there's a generation of older, not just yoga teachers, but yoga and movement teachers in their kind of 50s, 60s and older, that are just kind of retiring and just going, and because they're not, you know, on the Instagram, and they're not kind of, you know, they're not selling their things, like we're losing their wisdom as well as people who've been practitioners in kind of village halls and small spaces for 30-40 years, and kind of, you know, the amount of cultural knowledge that gets lost, and that brings me to the final question, which is actually from an anonymous one here, which is about kind of transmission and the speed, connectivity and scale of 21st century information access, and how that kind of fundamentally changes the nature of our interactions and in kind of cultural practices and artifacts, whether it makes things shallower and flatter, whether it makes things deeper and more diverse. What do you think?
I think it's certainly been faster. I mean, the rate of change in yoga in the past century is maybe the struggles. I don't want to premise again on like there's essentialism, but I think the changes have been faster and greater than we've ever seen historically, even though historically
Sure.
It's all changing. And that's also then tied back to things like colonialism, East-West exchange, and all that kind of stuff. And then now with the globalization of knowledge and social, you know, being online, it's changing all that much faster, right? That's also tied to, you know, as Theo, you're bringing up, the different shapes, different movements of power. Whereas now you'd have people who are, you know, have trained in a particular lineage, let's say in a Iyengar lineage, and they have 50 years of this practice, the granular details of that practice. But they might have a class, no one showing up to their class because someone else teaching in that studio has, you know, 100,000 followers on Instagram or TikTok. Right? So, and they may only have 2 years of yoga practice or virtually nothing, right? So yeah, but I think that what's interesting though is that maybe that also opens up the opportunity for bringing the issues in this discourse up faster, right? And maybe we have more positive change because of this quick movement.
Yeah, I'm also struck with what you were saying about the difference between being a passive and an active, kind of passive consumer and an active kind of steward of traditions. And I think in many ways, in terms of our consumption of online media generally, that's also a shift a lot of us need to start to make, rather than just passively consuming, you know, the media that comes at us. Is that I remember certainly the early days of the internet were much more kind of spaces for people to create and share and make in ways that allowed for that kind of exchange and curatorship, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, take back the internet and end capitalism and we'll be fine, right? All right, I'm aware of the time. Certainly it's getting later here. I know it's not quite so late for you, but I want to thank you again for a fantastic kind of talk, and everyone for their kind of questions and discussion.